Once upon a time in Russia, there really was a carefree, youthful generation that smiled in joy at the summer, the sea, and the sun, and chose Pepsi. These are the opening lines of Victor Pelevin's Generation P, published in English as Homo sapiens or as Babylon. The satirical novel explores the transformation of Russian society in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The protagonist, Babylon Tatarsky, had thought that he was well in contact with eternity and had achieved a stable and almost somnolent life for himself as a translator within the academic apparatus of the Soviet state. Instead, he finds himself manning a cigarette kiosk in chaotic 1990s Moscow. Through a series of whirlwind events, he finds himself in the advertising industry, which is a world where the boundaries between reality and illusion blur. For us, as primarily English speakers, primarily Western Europeans, it's hard to imagine a world without capitalism, without advertising, without money questions being first and foremost in the mind. But in the Soviet Union, where the revolution had taken place in 1917, the market economy was something that was beyond living memory. And then suddenly in the 1990s, all of the chaos and upheaval of the previous 50 plus years in the West came flooding in all at once. The sexual revolution, the attraction of New Age mysticism, the religions of the East, the drug culture, the various 1960s upheavals all came rushing in at the same time as there was a complete lack of centralized authority, a complete lack of rules, where money could be made and lost in extraordinary amounts, while meanwhile there were people who were actually seriously hungry in the streets. I've heard it said in response to the question, do you know post-Soviet literature, that one can answer yes, and his name is Victor Pelevin. He's a person that in my travels in Russia in the post-Soviet world is repeatedly mentioned, and he embodies many of these trends. His work is influenced by Buddhism, Eastern philosophy, disenchantment with capitalism, coupled with a willingness to an ability to see through the absurdity of the complete lack of a unifying ideology in post-Soviet Russia. Beyond his exploration of societal shifts, Pelevin is celebrated for his inventive use of allegory and symbolism. His narratives often blur the lines between reality and illusion, and they invite the readers to question the nature of truth and perception.
Welcome as usual, everyone. My name is Taylor Young.
I'm Sean Bell. Hi.
And we are, as Sean was just describing for us, today we're discussing Victor Pelevin's book, which is called Generation P in Russian, in English, either Babylon or Homo sapiens, I believe. So, yeah, I guess it would be good, I think, if you could go on and give us a little bit of a synopsis of the storyline, and then we'll just go bit by bit and we'll start talking about it.
Great. Well, so yeah, as I mentioned, the main character, Babylon Tatarsky, is born and raised in Brezhnev's Soviet Union, the 1970s Soviet Union, in which the ideals of communism are starting to seem a little bit hollow, and the effectiveness of the system in which they're living is becoming manifestly less and less successful. This is the era of breadlines. This is the era of blue jeans being an extraordinarily valuable prestige item if you can just get them into the country. It's an era where nobody really believes what they're saying. And yet within this world, the main character, Tatarsky, is able to find himself a comfortable little niche translating meaningless texts between the various Soviet languages. In his spare time, he's a poet. He considers himself an academic. He considers himself to be in touch with eternity. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union, all of these things which seemed so meaningful and stable and at least good enough to him, all of a sudden come to seem absurd and hollow. and he finds himself pretty near the bottom of what one could be doing, working for drug-addicted, murderous Chechens in a cigarette kiosk in downtown Moscow, trying to make ends meet by shortchanging his customers. As he's working there, he comes across an old acquaintance, and this guy puts him in touch with the burgeoning advertising industry.
That's his friend Morkovin. Am I right?
Yeah. And there is a passage that I wanted to read because it's funny. Give me a second here.
I liked the humor in this book. There's a lot of just like lines of dialogue or like descriptions of things. At the very beginning, it talks about what you're talking about, the end of the Soviet Union, and it says the Soviet state. I want to find what precedes it, or the Soviet Union entered nirvana by ceasing to exist.
Yes, it reached such a high state of perfection that it vanished out of existence.
Yes, I like that one.
Yeah. Morkovin comes with this explanation of 90s Russian business, which I will read out. Most of the time, said Morkovin, it goes like this. A guy borrows money on credit. He uses the credit to rent an office and buy a Jeep Cherokee and 8 crates of Smirnoff. When the Smirnoff runs out, it turns out the Jeep's wrecked, the office is awash with puke, and the loan is due for repayment. So he borrows money again, 3 times more than before. He uses it to pay back the first loan, buys a Jeep Grand Cherokee, and 16 crates of Absolute vodka. And so it goes. There's something, obviously it's over the top and grotesque and satirical, but there's something true about it. The business of this period had everything to do with the privatization of state industries, which was not done. How would I say this? It's not something that your libertarians would hold out as a triumph of capitalism, as a selection mechanism for competence and good decision making and providing value. Right? It was all about who was able to get a little bit of foreign capital together to buy poor people, desperate people out of their government-issued shares in these industries, and that's how people took control of these vast industries. That's how you get these oligarchs who were so prominent in the 90s and exist to this day in Russia. It was every bit about having a little bit of capital at the beginning or having access to the people with that capital. And then with the breakdown of central authority during these years, there was lawlessness of a sort that, I mean, even Americans who are accustomed, who have seen it, who have had it normalized, that our cities are going to be these, chaotic, violent places. We still really can't imagine what it would be like to live in a world of, private armies, basically, and separate warring mafias, where everything is ultimately decided by naked violence in the streets and open bribery.
Yeah, and I think that what comes through at some points in this book is, and you probably would know more about this than me, but kind of like embarrassment about this. Like there's some understanding that they're not. I mean, I think even it's expressed in what you were reading, where Morkovin, talking about that, and the point is it's kind of, it's a silly, like pointless cycle, and there's pretty much, at least to my mind, pretty much the whole book has this kind of like world weary, satirical, like mocking tone, which you could see it from the perspective of the characters or the people who lived at that time as functioning as like a defense mechanism to like help help deal with the difficulty of comparing themselves with America, now that the world's supposedly been opened and they're being introduced to capitalism, and they're being introduced to the West, and it's like you're saying, it's something that is in many ways appears very far beneath the Western standard. In the first section of the book, for a couple chapters at least, there's the idea of the Soviet mentality that crops up, and Tatarsky has to try to, it's basically like his job to try to understand what the Soviet mentality is and to apply it to advertising, I guess. So what do you think is the Soviet mentality, and have I got a good read on kind of what's going on here?
Yes, you've got a good reading of what's going on here regarding the sort of Russian shame and embarrassment. Certainly the 90s are a time that people will look back at with a sense of shame, a lot of them at least. However, it's interesting to me, and this mirrors what I have heard from the Russians that I've spoken to, that this shame and embarrassment is paired with a much deeper consciousness of the fakeness of the Western thing as well than you typically meet with in, I guess they're just more successfully cynical about Western capitalism, Western liberal democracy than even people who think of themselves as, dissidents or disillusioned with the system within the system. So yes, it's shabby and violent and brutal and nakedly not what it's pretending to be, the Russian variant of communism and liberal democracy. But I suppose you could also say that this is a defense mechanism to some extent to turn around and say, but yes, but your thing is fake too. And you don't even see it. At least we see that our thing is fake and ridiculous and grotesque. There are ways in which...
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's probably a fairer and more accurate statement than what I was saying. I've heard that there is, or there was, this saying in the post-Soviet countries that everything they told us about communism was false, meaning the communists, but everything the capitalists, or everything the communists told us about capitalism was true. So kind of goes with what you're saying.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that one, but I like it. Yeah, man. I suppose as we get further along in the plot, that becomes clearer that, like, not only is post-Soviet Russian oligarchic pseudo-capitalism being indicted, so too is the pure and relatively better established the Western variant, which, yes, works rather more smoothly. We'll get around to it. What was the other part of your question there? Or statement? There was something else?
No, I think that was it.
Okay.
I don't remember anything you didn't address. But so Tatarsky gets involved in advertising, and you can also see throughout the book, or at least my interpretation was that you can see a little bit of like a progression in the capitalist system in Russia, as well as the, I guess, thought about it or the consciousness about it, which remains cynical, but there's some development. So at the very beginning, I think they're like he and Morkovin and some of their friends. Yeah, but so at the beginning, he and Tatarsky and Morkovin and some of their friends are basically, they're going out, they're seeking out clients and pitching ads to them. There's already, let me try to find it, or actually I remember it pretty much off the top of my head, but I don't know if it's Morkovin or I think it's Morkovin again or someone else who tells him, advertising, the point of advertising in Russia is, in America, the advertiser and the person who's paying for the ad are trying to screw over the customer, and they're trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the customer, whereas here for us in Russia, we're trying to pull the wool over the eyes of our client, or the person who's paying for the ad, because they're really kind of paying for the prestige that comes with the ad, with like having an ad. There's less of this developed commercialism, and there's less of this developed understanding. And then there's a passage near the end of the book. We'll get to like how he gets there and what this all means, but he's part of this much bigger organization at that point that's doing like 3D modeling and like just a much larger enterprise. And I think it's actually Morkovin again who says, or describes at this point that they've like, advertising has begun to internalize the reaction to advertising and implement that itself. And you have ads that, like, the point of how they work is playing off of people's disgust with ads to, to sell an image of a place where you can be like free of this kind of consumerism, or at least that's the idea, or something like that. So I think that, again, in my interpretation, there's kind of through stuff like that, you can see like a progression in the development of the capitalist system, and arguably a very, very rapid progression, which I think is probably intentional and probably a a commentary on it in itself.
I agree with all that. I also remembered what the thing was that I didn't address, which was the Soviet mentality. So, if you don't mind, I might speak about that for a while and see if I
Yep.
can take that and bend it back towards what you were talking about. Because as you said, what Tatarsky is basically hired to do at his first position is to adapt Western advertising concepts to this Soviet mentality, despite the fact that nobody, especially not Tatarsky, really understands what this mentality entails. The idea is that it's perfectly fine that he doesn't understand it. What's important is that he has it. He was merely required to possess this mentality. First of all, it's maybe the first instance of an ongoing tendency in the novel, which is for the characters to go chasing around these abstract concepts which ultimately don't have any content to them, which slip through their fingers over and over and over again. The Soviet mentality, the Russian idea, which, bearing in mind that the whole story is ultimately a Buddhist critique of the idea that there is a self that is being subverted by advertising, right? That the replacement of one's quote true self unquote by the identity which is implanted in you by the capitalists is fake to begin with. I think that the way that every concept ends up being so elusive and faulty has something to do with that underlying tendency. But I think the clearest view we get of what the Soviet mentality is illustrated by this little example that we see with Tatarsky and his first boss. So to quote, for a test piece, Pugin set him the development of an outline concept for Sprite. At first he was going to give him Marlboro as well, but he suddenly changed his mind, saying it was too soon for Tatarsky to try that. This was the point, as Tatarsky realized later, at which the Soviet mentality for which he had been selected raised its head. All his skepticism about Pugin instantly dissolved into a feeling of resentment that Pugin wouldn't trust him with Marlboro. But this resentment was mingled with a feeling of delight at the fact that he still had Sprite. Swept away by the maelstrom created by these conflicted feelings, he never even paused to think why some taxi driver from Brighton Beach, who still hadn't given him so much as a kopeck, was already deciding whether he was capable of applying his mind to a concept for Marlboro. Yeah, it's funny. I think the Soviet mentality is, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is a true thing, but there's this older concept of the Russian slave soul. This idea that as a result of centuries of authoritarianism and serfdom, that the average Russian, it's a very condescending Western sort of idea, which you also get a certain sort of Russian, self-deprecatingly bringing up about themselves. It's this idea that this lack of room in which to engage in independent thought has made the people somewhat uncritical of authority, servile, a little resentful of it, but not willing to actively undermine the foundations of that authority itself. Anyway, yeah, that's I won't comment on whether it's true or not, because I'm not totally clear on it myself. As I've said, the degree of cynicism which your average Russian is capable of, in my experience, is deeper than what the average Westerner is capable of. There's a more thoroughgoing rejection of the foundations of the modern liberal democratic world order on display. Very, very normal people over there. But I suppose it's also true that there's even still a naivete which allows people to become truly invested in, well, for example, they have elections ongoing, right? And whatever you think about Russia, wherever you are on the spectrum of support for the current Russian regime, I think it's pretty clear to everybody that those elections are a farce. Yet there's a certain significant non-critical percentage of the population in non-critical thinking for who are able to naively buy into this. Maybe really what I think is that on the distribution of cynicism towards authority, there's just a wider distribution among the Russians than among us, right? Like there are more people who demonstrate this Soviet mentality of not asking questions about the basis or legitimacy of the authority, and instead get caught up in resenting the authority for not trusting them with the Marlboro account, and also being thoroughly delighted with the great opportunity of coming up with concepts about Sprite soda. There's more of those people, and then there are also more people who are deeply, thoroughly cynical about it. I suppose that's what I think, and that is how I understand the Soviet mentality in the book.
I see. Yeah, well, there's a lot there. It does seem to me like you were saying one of these concepts which the characters are chasing and never quite find. While you were trying to describe it, I was trying to compare it with American culture, for example, because there's also, in a way, there's a definitely like an anti-authoritarian element to American culture and to American self-image, but it definitely doesn't seem to express itself the same way. So I was thinking about the example here, and you talking about it, the Russian is resentful that he's not trusted with Marlboro, but at the same time he's delighted that he has Sprite, and kind of like that seems to kind of win over. I don't know how the American would like respond in the same scenario. Part of me wonders whether the American, it wouldn't even occur to him to like be resentful about being deprived of the Marlboro ad or Marlboro contract.
See, I
I don't
feel
know.
like an American from the very beginning would be, because you have to remember that the person who is offering these quote accounts unquote is once again a taxi driver from Brighton Beach. Right, so I do think that an American would be more apt to immediately say, "Hey, who the heck are you? What kind of advertising agency is this? Where is my contract? What are the terms of my payment?" Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's satirical, it's over the top, and yet having been in Russia, having more direct experience with the working conditions over there, I think there's something very true about it. I know a lot of people who do work without a contract, for instance, who find themselves being cheated out of payment that they have worked to earn. There's something true in it, which I don't quite understand, but it rings true with confusing things about the reality of even much more capitalism adept Russians in the modern era. Yeah, I've had a number of conversations with people about like, well, why don't you have a contract? Why don't you make the person sign a piece of paper and then take them to court when they don't pay you, right? But then you run into this thing of like officials being bribable and having very little recourse in the legal system.
Yeah, no, but just to circle back, I mean, it is a complicated concept, and I think you definitely have a better understanding of it. Certainly much more of a experience with it than I do. I did think that you also made a good point earlier about how there's a positive aspect to the cynicism that the characters display in the book, and that like they never even bother like going through the stage of actually believing in this system that's being foisted upon them. They just go straight into like seeing all the ways in which it's not what it portrays itself as. But I guess we could move on.
Can we talk about some of the advertising campaigns themselves?
Yeah,
They're
let's do that.
really funny. They're, I mean, they're not like seriously intended as actual advertising campaigns, but well, so yeah, I guess I'll talk about Sprite a little bit. If any of our older, if we happen to have any older listeners, there once upon a time in the 70s and 80s was an advertising campaign for Sprite, positioning it as the un-cola in direct opposition to Pepsi and Coca-Cola. And the attempt to Russianize this advertising campaign has the interesting connotation that because Coca-Cola possesses the, quote, taste of freedom, unquote, therefore the term uncola has extensive anti-democratic and anti-liberal connotations, which makes it highly attractive and promising in conditions of military dictatorship. That's the sort of thing that the imaginary advertising campaigns that Pelevin dreams up have to do with. We have Parliament cigarettes being paired with the Soviet coup against the Yeltsin government and advertised with tanks. Tanks occur a lot as an advertising touchstone within the Russian consciousness. And I just wanted to point out that even though they are silly and they are intended as jokes and satire to a certain extent, I will leave some links in the description to some early 90s Russian advertisements. And man, they are strange in a way that it is hard to explain in words. There are things that you can't imagine how it could possibly be connected to this brand that are disturbing and weird and sort of hallucinatory. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of where it's filmed in negative, where black is white and white is black, and the voice is distorted into some sort of it brings to mind like a demon voice or something. It's this bizarre hallucinatory thing, and at the end you find out that it's for some secondhand goods store somewhere in Moscow. So keep in mind as you read this book that, silly as it is, the reality is perhaps equally as weird when it comes to what advertising was like in the early 90s, when the Russians didn't quite understand what it was that they were supposed to be trying to do.
I certainly can believe that. I mean, yes, obviously, like you're saying, these are generally pretty over the top and silly sounding scenarios, but I don't know. I feel like when I just look at advertising in general, it's weirder than you give it credit for. It's hard to
yes.
sell something naturally to people. There's always some, obvious gimmick or something that if you stop and think about it, you're haha, that would never happen that way in reality. But at the same time, part of this still kind of works on you for some reason, and you want the thing that's being advertised. So I don't know. Advertising is inherently strange, I think.
Indeed.
Did you have any favorite ones that he comes up with? He kind of throughout the book, he gets better at coming up with ads. They're not all, some of them are these long scenarios where he describes how things are to be filmed and all that. And then he starts just coming up with one-liners for things. So did you have a favorite one?
The one that comes to mind is actually not one that Tatarsky comes up with, but it's his floridly nationalistic colleague who comes up with an advertisement for Harley Davidson.
Yeah, that one was, I didn't get it at all. Nothing that Malyutin came up with really. I can see why he ends up the way he does.
Yeah, it's the scenario is that there's a group of soldiers talking about. There's the soldier telling these other soldiers about this great officer, this hero he used to serve under, whose name was Harley. And they came back from the war, and this guy Harley was crushed by the modern conditions and came to a very sad end. This war hero, and this is paired with a sort of vulgar caricature of a Haredi Jew named Davidson coming out and riding a motorcycle, and the tagline is, "How long will the Davidsons be riding on the Harleys?" It's just to give you an idea of the goofy sorts of things that these drugged out and generally confused Russian advertising executives come up with throughout the course of the book.
Yeah. One of my favorites was near the end where Tatarsky is talking with Morkovin and he's asking him about things that he doesn't know about yet and realizes that he shouldn't be asking about. So he says, never mind, forget it. And Morkoven says, dead right, why would you strain your brains on your salary? Less you know, the easier you breathe. And Tatarsky thinks to himself that would make a great slogan for Davidoff cigarettes.
Yep. Yeah, well, so I suppose that talking about advertising campaigns is a good way to transition into the more mystical content of the book, because it's as Tatarsky is trying to, he's struggling with writer's block when it comes to the Parliament cigarette account, that he first ends up reading this obscure samizdat publication dealing with
like Sumerian mythology.
Yes, exactly. Dealing with Sumerian mythology, which is an ongoing theme in the book, which I'll be interested to know what you make of it, because I have a hard time figuring out what exactly is meant there.
Yeah, well, so he reads this, and I think initially he kind of just goes about his way. He remembers some things from it, and there's things that keep reoccurring. He's reading it, I think, about this, and his interpretation of what it actually is referring to develops and changes. But this ritual in which in ancient Babylon, someone would climb the tower of Ishtar, and there would be three riddles that they're confronted with along the way. And he kind of at various points in the book, he is deciding that, maybe this was a physical tower, maybe it's like a drug trip, maybe it's something symbolic in a different way. Maybe the Tower of Babel story in the Bible was just like people were on drugs, so they weren't able to understand each other. So you get this introduction of both like ancient mysticism and ancient religions and the goddess Ishtar and three riddles and also drug use. So then he goes to visit his friend Gireyev, who lives in the countryside and who's a Buddhist, I think, I gather. And he does some mushrooms with him, and then he like eats some more when they're out in the walk, and apparently they're the wrong kind, so he like begins hallucinating, and then he goes, well, I'm kind of moving along at a quick pace here, but I'll ask you if you have anything to say before I get too carried away running through the story.
I guess there's just something inherently discordant about the pairing of advertising and marketing and capitalism with sort of the most ancient mystical wisdom content that we have in written form. I think that's like a deliberate pairing, right? That's why he would want to invoke Sumeria, is to make it as jarring as possible. It's also one of those things where like reality sort of converges with fiction in a way. This book was written in 1999, which I think probably it's before it was a mainstream thing to know about these sort of vaguely Buddhistic, drug tripping Silicon Valley tech bro guys who are, seeking the true insight of how to market their stupid, manipulative, useless products via the ancient wisdom of the ayahuasca camps that these folks are going to down in South America these days. It almost functions as a prediction, looking back in retrospect, because I can't imagine that in 1999 somehow Victor Pelevin knew about this going on. It's an odd instance.
Victor Pelevin didn't know about Joe Rogan asking people if they've done DMT.
Right, exactly. And yet the world has sort of caught up to Victor Pelevin in 1999, where these dubious characters are experimenting with powerful chemicals and dabbling in, mystical wisdom for very shallow, self-serving reasons.
Yeah, that's a very interesting parallel. I didn't think of it myself, but I think you're totally right that you could definitely be seen as foreshadowing that. Yeah, so I think you asked, or you said that to you this is kind of discordant. So this is one of the parts where I'm not sure like how I think about the book. I kind of generally have a tendency when I read something to try to like see it from what I think is the author's point of view, to like try to figure that out, unless there's something about it that like I disagree with so strongly or like doesn't make sense. It kind of jars me out of it. So it's difficult for me to kind of opine on it myself because I'm not sure what he meant by it. And from my perspective, I guess you could come away with a kind of tongue-in-cheek answer that maybe advertising is just actually inherently demonic. And that's how you get ahead in this business, is you actually take drugs and commune with demons, and that's why people are doing it in real life as well. But
the thing there is the value judgment associated with like demonic and stuff, right? We have to remember that we're not dealing with a Christian author.
That's my point. That's what I'm saying, in that I could kind of say that as like half as a joke, but I doubt that's what he meant. But what did he mean by it? I don't know. I think is what you were saying as well.
I guess, okay, so I think it becomes clearer with the final relating of the myth, right? Do you remember at the very end when he's being initiated into the cults, and the myth of the goddess who was mortal and who alienates herself from her own death? And to punish her for that, they turn the goddess into gold, and they turn her death into this menacing 5-legged dog which sleeps in the snow and occasionally wakes up to wreak havoc.
Yeah.
And the dog is named Fuck Up, Phukkup.
Yeah, I tried to do a little research to see if that actually comes from Sumerian mythology, or like which parts of this are just made up for the book. I think that one's just made up for the book. I don't know. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I mean, how funny it would be if the Sumerians happened to come up with a demon dog named Fuck Up. Yeah, so I think that gets to what he's trying to evoke here, right? He's calling up the most ancient thing that we recognize as a complex civilization, Sumeria, and associating it with marketing, which we tend to think of as this modern, quote, scientific, unquote, phenomenon, which, I mean, it would feel less discordant to me to associate marketing with, like, behavioral psychology and focus groups and men in lab coats seeing what people do and seeing how people react to a product in an experimental setting, and statistics and surveys and things like that. That's what we like to think that that marketing and capitalism have to do with. I think that he's making it more ancient, right? And positioning. Every time I say positioning, positioning is an advertising word which keeps being brought up through the course of the story. So every time I say positioning, it feels weird. The goddess of gold, who is sort of at the very roots of the discord of the world in which we live. I think that's. I mean, in a way, maybe it's such an obvious thing that it almost feels trite to say it out loud. Right? Money is the root of all evil. I think that there's something like, naive and post-communist, which makes it through even Pelevin's thorough cynicism, which sees money and capitalism and markets in this, to me, like sort of childish way. But maybe that's just me undergoing the displacement reflex.
Well, can I stop you there? So,
yes, we'll get around to that.
Because I think what you're saying is that this comparison between modern capitalist consumerism and advertising with this ancient religion and ancient civilization, it's supposed to say something, right? It's supposed to be making some point. So would you agree? And what do you think that is? Is it like what you're saying, that basically the point is just kind of like nothing ever changes? Money is always has been the root of all evil. Like the pursuit of wealth has always like had negative effects on people, or it's something that we just can't get away from through human nature.
It's that, but it's not just that. We have to keep in mind that there's this Buddhist angle, right? So if it were just that money is evil and it makes people compromise themselves, then, fine, there's something true about that, a little bit trite. But I think the thing that makes it a little bit more interesting is that it's not just that money and advertising and the use of things like screens, which take away the agency of the self and make your attention be the object of some external manipulator. It's not just that those things are insidious, it's also that this, quote, true self that sort of bourgeois hippies are trying to get back to, that thing is also false. Right, so that's where it gets a little bit deeper, and this is just hinted at around the edges of the story. But this is where the Buddhist thing comes in, where the self is an illusion, and really what you need to do is transcend the ego, transcend these worldly concepts which sort of collapse into sand whenever you try to grasp onto them. And the way you do that, as I understand it, I'm not a Buddhist myself, but it's by practicing meditation, inhabiting the present moment, and being very, very conscious of the fact that this thing that we think we are, which is the self, is an illusion and that it can deceive you at any moment.
And
Right.
by turning the TV upside down when you need to watch the news.
This is true because, sometimes you just need to have the TV on. There's some important information there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, but then what does all that have to do with the goddess Ishtar? Why all the allusions to ancient Babylon or Sumeria?
That is interesting. Yeah, because why specifically that rather than some cultural context where
Or, I guess more to the point of what I'm asking, like in my understanding, that is not similar to Buddhism. It seems to be like a different category of civilization, different category of religion. So if this is all, if like, I don't know if this is what you're saying necessarily, but if kind of like the author's approach or his personal bias creeping through is more of like the Buddhist perspective, then again, like what is meant by this, how closely the story ties together his material pursuits with like looking back to or like all this mystical ancient Babylonian mythology and imagery.
yeah, that's a worthy criticism. Yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. Why exactly Babylon? I'm not a great Bible expert, but isn't there this tendency to view? I guess maybe I'm thinking more about like Rasta dudes, but isn't there this tendency to use the term Babylon as a catch-all?
Yeah, it's kind of a general evil connotation.
Right,
Um,
everything that is fallen, everything that is crass and vulgar and worldly.
it's like the pinnacle of human self-centeredness and human rebellion against God.
I would guess that it's something like that. But yeah, I think the problem with Babylon as sort of an associative nexus is that it doesn't have, as far as I know about Babylon, once again, I'm no expert, but I think you're right in saying that there's nothing inherent to that cultural context that would give you a good way of opposing it from this quasi-Buddhist perspective. I mean, you do see it coming up in the sort of treatise that the ghost of Che Guevara writes via Ouija board.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I know you do see it, but I just want to stay on this a little bit longer because this is one of the most interesting aspects of the story to me. But so, what do you then make of the fact, the references to the end of the world and the references to Judgment Day? And it's referred to as such a couple of times, but in addition to that, you have Tarski's vision where he sees Enkidu, or I think first he reads about it, the myth of Enkidu, who's created by the god to gather up the people that used to be beads, or the beads that used to be people, which the dragon that comes to him in a vision explains to him that he's got it wrong. But anyway, so you have Enkidu's created by god Enki to gather these up, and that's the end of the world, and that's Judgment Day, and it's obviously the description of how he does it. He gathers them like beads on a string is directly parallel to Che Guevara's description of how like the consumerist society functions, where people are reduced to just like an intake and output. He uses more crude terms, but you know what I'm getting at. But that's one thing I noticed is that you have this, I think, very clear kind of parallel. You have this ancient myth where, like, at the end of the world, people are gathered up like beads on the string, and they've lost their humanity. I think it's probably fair to say. And then you have a very, like, a basically identical description applied to how the world that is regulated by mass media and by the television and by advertising and consumerism works. So what do you think about that?
I think it's very interesting that the key to the myth is outside of the myth, right? Because the key to the myth is that it's not beads that think they're people. It's that they're people who think they're beads, right? But that's not in the myth. It's not in the content of what I think we're to interpret as the basic religious content of this story world. I think it makes the gods of this story world
Well, I think
evil.
maybe that's where you're. Well, that's interesting. I shouldn't have interrupted you, but I was just going to say maybe that's like where you seeing the more Buddhist perspective comes in. Is that like the answer to this is just stop thinking of yourself the wrong way. I mean, I can't put it as well as you can, but
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Let's say that this myth is just the truth of this story world, right? This is the background god content of this story world. It's an interesting thing that salvation comes from somewhere that is not within the corpus of the myth. I guess that makes it very individualistic, anti any sort of established religion, and it very much does make the gods of this story world into evil, depersonalizing entities who take us away from our true selves, which is, I guess, it fits with this, with what I understand of Pelevin as being this proponent of, well, mysticism and individual experience of the divine. But it also strikes me as potentially subversive and maybe bad. I don't know.
from a Christian perspective, that is basically demonic in like
Yes.
literal sense.
Yes.
The idea that the gods are actually evil and they're the problem, and you have to like liberate yourself. I'm not trying to like. Well, maybe I am. I don't think there's actually anything wrong with myself moralizing about the story, but there's definitely a number of biblical references. There's one. I'm not sure if you would have caught this or not, but in like the last third of the book or so, when Azadovsky introduces himself again, when he's, this big, powerful, important person now, he introduces himself again to Tatarsky, and he tells him his real name also isn't Leonid, it's Legion from the Bible, which was the name that a demon or a group of demons identified itself as.
I did not catch that. Okay. Go on.
Yeah, and then you have when after Tatarsky takes acid, you have this thing that calls itself Seraph or Seraph, which is a little confusing to me. I couldn't figure out what kind of reference that was supposed to be, or if it was supposed to be one or not. Seraph in the Bible, or generally speaking, is like a type of angel, but it's described as looking more like a dragon than anything else, which is, again, something that's typically has an evil association. So, I know that that's not the perspective that the author is coming from, but it's interesting that from my perspective, it kind of fits. Like, yes, I would expect that if you did a lot of drugs while being like selfish, awful person, you probably would see some spiritual entities that aren't friendly to you.
Yes, and I think that there's a distinct possibility that this is deliberately subversive book from a Christian perspective. I think there's a distinct possibility of that, although it's all done sort of by hints and allusions.
Yeah, definitely. I have one other thought about this. I feel like I've been coming up with a lot here, so I'll hand it back off to you. But so I think when we were talking before we started recording, I said that I wasn't sure whether I liked the direction that the story took with, you have all this mysticism and all these images and symbols. And so, for example, when he reads about the Sumerian mythology, he reads about this ritual of ascending the tower and the three tests or three questions that you have to answer to get up to the top and marry the goddess Ishtar. And then he has his drug trip on the mushrooms. He finds this like old dilapidated Soviet tower or something. As he's going up, it kind of parallels. He finds three things. I think they're a box of Parliament cigarettes, coin from Cuba with Che Guevara's face on it, and then I think it's what's the word? It's a pencil sharpener, I think, that looks like a television with an eye painted on it. Obviously these are things that reoccur and kind of like are like map out the trajectory of the rest of the story for him. And we've been talking about all the Sumerian symbolism and what it could possibly mean. He has this weird dream at one point, and then he talks to this hallucination seraph that kind of partly explains the dream to him and so on. But as you get to the end of the book, I don't know, it's not like it's necessarily real in the sense that like others are scientifically certain that the goddess Ishtar exists or something like that, but he's inducted into this cult, and like everything that previously was a symbol or was something mystical becomes attached to something actual and something physical. And and I don't know how I felt about that. It wasn't what I was expecting, that's for sure. And it kind of just like threw me for a loop when I was trying to think about the story. The other thought that I just wanted to say that I had, generally speaking, pretty much before I got to like that last section of the story was, and again, this is something from my perspective reading the book that maybe wasn't necessarily the author's intention, or maybe it kind of was, that you have this situation in Russia, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have basically the collapse of the world that people were familiar with, and this entrance into something that's totally unknown to them previously. And you have throughout the book this increasing description of the complexity of the capitalist consumerist system and how it functions, and this kind of like building idea that it's so much bigger than like not just one person, but even like a plan or a group of people or like a group interest or anything like that. It's something that just is, and it just keeps growing, and it's out of really anyone's hands. My thought for like first maybe half of the book was that there is a lot of religious allusions and a lot of religious symbolism, and to me it kind of represented how that kind of tendency, almost you could say, to superstition is something that's just inherent in humanity. And you think about it, I feel like there's this kind of contrast where these people are being inducted into the most advanced system and the most advanced civilization in human history, the grandeur of Western liberal capitalism, and they're like starting cults and having weird rituals and worshiping a goddess from like the total opposite end of the known history of humanity. It's like I feel like you could maybe kind of see in it another kind of like the Soviet mentality, another criticism of maybe these people specifically and their response to things that like an uncontacted tribe seeing an airplane or something like that, and they start worshiping it. But I also kind of just saw a general illustration of the human tendency to superstition, and kind of like as we get more advanced and more materialistic, it's not necessarily that we cease worshiping things as a whole, as a species. It's just that arguably it maybe just makes less sense than it ever did. So I don't know what your thoughts are about all that.
I think that a lot of what we've been talking about for maybe got out in front of our skis as far as the amount of like summary and synopsis we've given to our listeners is. So what I'm going to do is explain some of the plot, right? Like we're talking about this cult where we brought in Nazadovsky. I just fear that it's going to have become sort of incomprehensible to listeners who haven't read the book.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's find it kind of difficult to talk about in parallel with just like a linear synopsis, but
yeah,
I think it's definitely good to bring us back to earth in that sense. So go ahead.
So from his original position working for a Brighton Beach taxi cab driver, whom it's unclear how he has any money and why he should be treated as any sort of legitimate business owner, Tatarsky works himself up this vague sort of hierarchy with bosses going missing and being murdered in gang wars. And yet, with every cataclysm, the star of our protagonist somehow or another keeps rising. He keeps being drawn up to higher and higher levels of advertising complex. And at the highest level, it emerges that the most significant marketing campaign of all is that of the political system, which, with me explaining it like that, it sounds a little ham-handed and obvious. It maybe in some sort of, it's not the most subtle thing in the world. But keeping in mind that this is written in 1999, the idea that the entire, not just the Russian state, but the various government apparatuses of the entire liberal democratic world, the idea that these are all deep fakes is an extraordinarily prescient idea. And yeah, as it turns out, everybody from Yeltsin on down, everybody starting with Ronald Reagan's second term in the United States has been a computer program, all managed by advertisers and editors and copywriters and various capital C creatives who are members of this weird shadowy cult of Ishtar that we've been mentioning. That ends up being more or less the truth. However, it's left deliberately ambiguous what the power behind all this is. Right? It ends up being this situation where, Tatarsky himself asks, like, gosh, who tells the copywriters what to say? Who says what the advertising campaign should be? His boss, who's explaining all this, says, well, it's the oligarchs. And then he thinks about it for a second, and he realizes, wait, but the oligarchs we animate the oligarchs. We create them in our studio. They don't exist. And it becomes this funny situation where the 7th floor copywriters are based on the 8th floor, and the 8th floor refers back to the 7th floor for reference. And if you think about it too hard, you should really just prick yourself with a pin and go back to doing your job, because otherwise you're not going to get paid and you'll be back working in a cigarette kiosk. So probably don't ask these questions. And that's sort of the end point that we get to as far as understanding what's really going on. It's this, more than anything else, it's this ancient religion of, well, money worship, ego worship, this investment in false realities and false selves, the only escape from which it is alluded to is something like Buddhism, something like the realization that not only are the things that advertising sells to you fake, but so too is the material world, your, quote, self, unquote. These are also illusions which produce suffering, which you must somehow transcend. Yeah, so hopefully that brings our listener back into some degree of correspondence with what we're talking about. Yeah, it's another interesting thing that I eventually wanted to get around to was the way that this final myth of the goddess who is gold, who is alienated from her own death, and the death is made into a 5-legged dog, which sleeps in the snow and occasionally wakes up to cause havoc. I think that there's an encoded explanation of there's something that points to what the Russian idea might be, which is another ongoing theme of the book.
So what do you mean by that?
I guess maybe I'll go back and talk about the Russian idea, which, just as with the Soviet mentality, is an ongoing theme which is never quite resolved in a neat fashion. Basically, one of the advertising campaigns that Tatarsky is tasked with dreaming up at an earlier stage of the story is to market Russia itself, to come up with some sort of unifying myth a Russian idea which explains what this country is all about, what it is doing, what its purpose in the world is. So to quote basically he's a gangster thug who is commissioning this idea. Oh, and keep in mind that there is a word which will recur a lot of times, mazuma, which evidently is a slang term for money. I've never come across it in the wild. Keep in mind that that word means money. Right. Our national business is expanding into the international market. Out there's all kinds of mazuma doing the rounds. Chechen, American, Colombian. You get the picture. And if you look at them all like mazuma, then they're all the same. But in actual fact, behind every kind of mazuma, there's a national idea. We used to have orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Then came this communism stuff. Now that's all over, and there's no idea left at all except for the mazuma. There's no way you can have nothing but mazuma behind mazuma, right? Because then there's just no way to understand why some mazuma's up front and some's in behind, right? It's a very vulgar character putting in rather vulgar terms the true thing that if you want people to be inspired by Russia as an idea, there needs to be something more to it than the country running like an LLC. In much the same way as there's this mythology of America, which allows people to be suckered into continuing to support this evil empire, which really at the highest level sees itself as nothing more than an economic zone. However, the problem with the Russian idea is that, basically nobody knows what it is, and a lot of it has to do with this feeling of inferiority, which we were referring to earlier. So this mafia gangster kind of character talks about his motivations for wanting a Russian idea, and mostly it's about how when he goes over to the fancy, highfalutin international circles to the Caribbean islands or wherever it is that the ultra rich people hang out, he feels this sense of being looked down upon because there's this lack of any sort of unifying notion to Russia. As Tatarsky goes along, trying to go out to the people, ask them what they think about it, all he really finds is more of this resentment and uncertainty. Later on in the story, there's a little hint at the Russian idea, which, as far as I can tell, is the idea that the post-Soviet, post-Yeltsin Russian state of Putin has been trying to sell, that of the Third Rome, right? The idea that Russia is somehow destined for greatness as being the true inheritor of the civilization which moved from Rome to Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, and then was transmitted to Russia as this safeguard of the Orthodox religion. To the extent that there is a Russian idea, I think that's one of the main contenders, right? Along with this sort of, I suppose there's this alternate version of Russia as this guarantor of multipolarism and of this multicultural, multi-ideological resistance to liberal hegemony. But in any case, what we get at the very end of the story is this myth of a world in which the gods are mortal. And there's one particular goddess who is particularly disturbed by her own mortality. And so she alienates herself from her death. She makes her death into a separate entity from herself. And as such, she becomes very powerful and a threat to the rest of the gods. And their revenge against her is to turn her into an abstract concept. The goddess Ishtar becomes gold, right? So this is perhaps the carrot of the carrot and stick that we see in this story, right? And then the stick is what becomes of her death. Her death becomes, as we've already mentioned, a 5-legged dog called Fuck Up with a PH, which sleeps in the snow and occasionally awakens to cause havoc. And I think this is what Pelevin, in a very roundabout way, is suggesting as a variant of the Russian idea, right? Because fuck up, the thing that wakes up and causes havoc every once in a while, lives in Russia, and the Russians are those who must keep him sleeping. I think that there's something here, right? That in order to keep this global cult of gold, this thing which keeps people reduced to this state of lower beings who can really only conceptualize taking in and then expelling resources, that Russia is kind of the linchpin of this system because the death of the goddess personified in the occasionally destructive god fuck up who woke up in 1917, for instance, and caused a lot of problems for the hegemonic liberal democratic beast before eventually being put back to sleep and the Eastern Bloc reintegrated into the liberal world order to some extent. I don't have the end of that thought, but do you see where I'm going with this, Taylor? Do you see
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I think I had pretty much the same thought about it as well. So at the end, they're describing to him this myth and how the evil side of the goddess is this dog that's sleeping, and it's sleeping in Russia. And I had a couple thoughts about it. So who is he talking to at this point? Whoever Tatarsky's talking to, I think it's a politician guy whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce. It starts with an F. Says, I think you understand that here in Russia we bear a special responsibility. The dog sleeps here. There's several times a century he has almost awoken. So what I thought of when I read that, so I actually don't understand this mechanism in the story, but they talk about how the power, or the frequency rather, that they get to run their big advertising computer and their, where they generate all the deep fakes of the politicians and everything, it's dependent on America somehow. I don't know if you want to jump in and kind of help explain that before I get to where I'm going with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no computer expert, but I think it's basically like server capacity, right? The servers are located in the United States, so they're still totally dependent on American goodwill to run their computers to render the images to continue the existence of the fake political system.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so there is that, and then here they're talking about that their role as an organization is to keep this dog sleeping. And what it reminded me of is, I know we were talking a little while ago about the Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, and I've still only seen the first third or so, the first hour, which is basically him explaining over and over again how Russia tried to basically integrate itself into the Western liberal order. And from his perspective, or from the Russian perspective, it put up with quite a lot of insults and of just, pretty blatant attacks against it or against its interests. And it kept trying to nevertheless extend the hand and integrate itself. I think it's what you're saying, that part of the reason the antagonism toward Russia by America and by the liberal system is because it is still a little different. It is viewed as a competitor, as something that isn't fully a part of the system and isn't fully subservient to American Jewish capitalism. So it's connection to me is that history that we see from our vantage point today is the failure by America to do its part in keeping the dog sleeping, basically, and taking the opportunities that it could have taken to subdue Russia by integrating it and by subverting it from within. And instead, through their antagonism, has instead forced Russia to become more nationalistic, even if it is a very cynical form of nationalism in many ways, more self-reliant, and you could see it as having, I don't know what you were trying to get at, but that was a big part of what I thought about when I read that.
Yeah, man, very much so. That idea that no matter how cynical, no matter how grotesque the modern Russian political system is, despite the fact that it is grotesque and brutal and functions poorly and it is anti-white, it is subverted by Jewish interests. This is true. It is an awful, awful tragedy that all these white people are dying right now. and the Russian state has significant guilt in this. And yet still, I find myself being, to some extent, a Russophile, because the fact is that they're not integrated yet. The fact is that what Pelevin's Che Guevara calls the displacement impulse, which makes it so that people are unable to think of realities that are not able to be explained in terms of capitalism, in terms of acquiring resources and then expending them in a gratuitous consumeristic way. The fact that that process, which displaces all other ways of relating to the world, has not yet been fully realized in Russia, means that means that the dog can wake up there, and that's why I still find myself sympathizing with them. And you see it in the people, man. You see it talking to the people there that, like, despite the fact that, yes, it's bad there and you shouldn't be an uncritical, Z person, you shouldn't be an uncritical Putin lover, in my opinion. Nonetheless, there is a healthy thing still there in the heart of Russia, which should be awakened, despite the fact that from the perspective of the religion of money, the religion of illusions, the religion of Ishtar and Babylon and the self and all these revolting things, despite from the fact from that perspective, it's this horribly destructive demon dog named Faka. From my perspective, I think it's a good thing that perhaps the dog wakes up and gets a little bit rowdy. And yeah, I think it's still sleeping there. It's just that maybe from my perspective, the Russian idea should be to poke the dog and get it rampaging around a little bit, rather than lulling it to sleep for the benefit of world-spanning capitalism and Jewish power.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with that last part. I mean, I think that a lot of things you brought up would be a whole conversation in and of themselves. But generally speaking, I think it's very similar to what I was trying to say. Basically, the way I would put it is that the antagonism from the West has protected Russia from the ways that it would have suffered by instead being America's friend. And that is not necessarily what the Russians themselves wanted, but they at least had the moral fortitude and the courage to realize that they were being poked and shoved around, that there was going to be a point where they tolerate it anymore. So yeah, again, to kind of bring it back to the story from my perspective, that is, you can see it as like a sequel to the last couple chapters here, where the Americans stop appreciating what they're doing, they stop cooperating, and so the cult of Ishtar gets some setbacks in Russia.
Cool.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you what you thought about one more thing, which is almost at the very end of the second to last chapter. Tatarsky has this thought, what if we're the dog?
Oh, does he? Is that an actual quote? How did I miss
yes.
that? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it's right as he's about to be 3D scanned. He said, I just thought, I had this rather frightening thought, that dog with 5 legs, maybe it's all of us together and we're all on the attack, sort of. I kind of don't know how to fit that into anything else that we've been talking about, other than maybe it's like a general realization on his part that maybe they're the ones that are doing something destructive, and they're not maintaining order in like a morally positive sense, but they're doing something that's destructive to some larger good, like the nation or something like that. But I was curious what your thoughts were about that.
Do you have the page number of that?
On this English edition I have, it's very bottom of page 131, almost at the very bottom.
Oh, yes, I found it. Yeah, I guess it all depends on the we. Oh, it's okay. So the we is Generation P. The we is that last generation to come up through Soviet education and to be prepared for that world, only to have that world snatched away from them and replaced with something else. Which is, it's a very interesting group of people. They're, around 50 now. A lot of them were knocked flat by the 90s, man. There were a lot of people who got into drugs from that generation who really just ended up in a bad situation. A lot of interesting people too. A lot of the coolest people I met over in Russia were like people who became weird oriented, mystical, hippie sort of people. as soon as that information reached them, who have been inoculated against a lot of the bad stuff that they would have gotten if they had had the dubious honor of being America's friend, as you brought it up. But yeah, it all depends on who is the we, right? Because the dog, as I understand it, when it starts going on the attack, it ends up being destructive to everything, yes, but destructive in particular to the false religion of Ishtar. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so if we keep running with the myth or whatever it is, the goddess was trying to achieve something that was unnatural and that was, arguably in that sense unjust. It was outside of the natural order of how things should be. She was trying to achieve immortality and ultimately had her death separated from herself. So you could see it as kind of like you're saying now. Like, I don't remember at this point actually if they necessarily imply that the dog is like generally destructive, or if it's reuniting her with her mortality, with the natural end that she should have faced. And I think that definitely can be made into a generally political, philosophical allegory where you have this system, this consumerist capitalist system, as it's described in the book, as this thing that will forever perpetuate itself as it reduces humanity to like a lower form of being. And, it brings to mind the whole idea of the end of history and like the eternal reign of capitalist democracy throughout the rest of time. It has this image of itself as being something final and something eternal. And you could bring it all the way back to the concept of the Tower of Babel and like the Christian allusions in this story. Like, this is humankind finally achieving immortality without God. And so in that sense, you could see the dog as something that should happen, something that restores a natural balance and brings an end to something that is inherently destructive and unnatural, and it's trying to achieve something which is unnatural and wrong. So I'm kind of just repeating myself, but
I think you're totally right. There's this idea that capitalism is basically based on putting off further and further the inevitable backlash to itself. It strikes me as there being something very, very true in there, right? There's this printing money and inflating the debt to continue to not have to deal with the consequences of what this system has perpetuated. Just doing whatever they have to do to stop anyone from waking up to it. You did about the question of what the dog attacks back on 127. On 127, Azadovsky asks, and who is it that this fuck up attacks in this article? And Tatarsky responds, not anyone or anything special, just everything in general. That's probably why the other gods interfered. So I mean, sorry, I'm stumbling, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. I didn't. Yeah, okay. I didn't. I didn't remember that part, but I guess you could see that as, again, like a description of mortality generally and of things having an end. I think maybe to try to go into it in too much detail isn't really helpful to the point of making it an allegory. But the point is that this separation of the goddess from her death itself was an unnatural thing, so you would expect it to really only have destructive effects. But yeah, again, I don't think it really takes away from the general point I was making. Yeah, so is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or anything you felt like we didn't cover, or have we given a good enough discussion to the audience?
I think we've hit pretty much everything I wanted to hit. And also, like, I don't know, I feel like we have shown some light on things that I hadn't seen before.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you very much, and we'll see you guys on the next one.